Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World in my continuing series on Christmas. And we're in the first week of Advent, and I'm going to continue my considerations of the general history of Christmas. In particular, I want to talk about the date. How did we settle on December 25th? And how do we evaluate the many claims about when Jesus was actually born? What the relationship is between Christmas and Roman solstice festivals like the Sol Invictus and the Saturnalia and so forth. There's a lot of mess, and it's actually really simple if you throw out all the trash. So let's begin carting out some of that rubbish. So let's take several different approaches to the question of why Christmas Day is December 25th. And the first thing we know for absolute sure is that if Jesus was born on that day, it would be an amazing coincidence because the date of the year that he was born on has a probability of 1 in 365. Now, we just don't know when he was born. Now, evangelical Christians in the modern era take Luke's narrative about Mary and Gabriel's visit and his relationship to John the Baptist. Luke claims that John the Baptist and Jesus were first cousins, and this is outlined in a section which is now celebrated in the Visitation of Mary, and so on. And in Luke's testimony, there are some statements about the father of John the Baptist and his obligations to the temple, and so if you take those as historically accurate, then it is theoretically possible to determine a date on which John the Baptist and Jesus were born if you know the year, because the temple obligations for different tribes within Judah, or kinship groups within Judah, are pegged to the lunar calendar, and so they're going to switch from year to year. So that's going to be one problem. But the problem that is of greatest weight as far as I'm concerned, and which I talked about last week, is that Luke's narrative is all folklore. It doesn't mesh with anything historical or anything that we can prove historically. So all of those determinations based on Luke's narrative are just useless. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus next week, and the virgin birth, and a lot of other things in connection with Hebrew prophecy and whatnot. I'll talk about all of that next time. Let's just talk about how the date of December 25th got fixed in the church calendar. And it is important, and it is clearly connected to the winter solstice. In the calendar that the early church fathers were using, December 25th was the winter solstice. So yes, the relationship between the birth of Jesus and the celebration of the solstice, they are connected. I will admit that. What I'm not going to admit is that the date was chosen because it was an ancient festival already, like the festival of Sol Invictus or Saturnalia or whatever. I don't accept that at all. And what we need to do is to look at the testimony of the early church fathers to figure out their reasoning. Now, one of the things we know for absolute certain is that in the ancient world, birthdays were generally not celebrated, weren't important. And the birthdays of saints, incidentally, are also not important in the ecclesiastical calendar to this day. The day that we celebrate saints on is the day they died, because that is, at least theoretically, the day in which they are entered into paradise. And so it's an important date. The birthday is not important. And we don't have a lot of references to the dates of birth of the saints in the ancient and medieval period. They weren't important. People didn't have birth certificates. The date of birth wasn't recorded. I'm also going to talk about the genealogies sometime, maybe next week or the week after. The genealogies in Matthew and Luke, and I'll talk about how they are related to the birth of Jesus. So a lot of people in the ancient world had no idea when they were born, and curiously enough, there are a lot of cultures, even in the modern world, where people don't know. When I was in Sarawak, in the Dayak territory in the mountains of Sarawak last year, I met quite a few people who had no idea what their actual date of birth was, which is a problem because when they applied to be Malaysian citizens, they needed to put down a date of birth. And so they just made it up. I mean, they knew roughly, you know, their parents would say, oh, well, you were born when we were planting the rice, or we were harvesting the rice, or we were clearing the fields, or something like that. That's about it. You know, like, I remember you being born because I couldn't go plant rice that year, or some such. And then they had to make something up for the government. And that's true of quite a number of contemporary cultures, although most nations now issue birth certificates, so it's becoming more prevalent that people know when their birthday is. It's not necessarily an important date. An element of narcissism in it, like your birthday, the day you were born. Like, why is that important to anybody? And the date that Jesus was born was certainly not important to the early church. But we do know that by the 4th century, the church was celebrating Christmas on December 25th. And it continued indefinitely after that time, but it wasn't until the 4th century that it was established. Now, St. Augustine says that it's a significant date when you think about what the solstice means and how it relates to the nativity. So Augustine says that the solstice marks the turning point of the year, the coldest time of the year, the darkest time of the year in the northern hemisphere, which is where all of this was taking place. Nobody was thinking about this in Australia or in South America in the 4th century, because they didn't even know that those places existed at that time, so they weren't worried about it. But they looked at the winter solstice and they said, from this point on, the days are getting longer and they're getting warmer and we're moving into spring. So it's a perfect time to celebrate the birth of our hope. Now, our hope is going to grow piece by piece by piece over time. And of course, if you saw my video on the Advent calendar, you'll see that that's an important issue too, that the hope for a new Savior is going to grow and grow and grow. And so the solstice should be the appropriate day to mark the birth of that Savior. So it's sort of calendarically symbolic. But it's also important to have the Nativity now leading into spring, leading into Easter. And historically, Christmas and Easter were very closely related. I mean, they still are ecclesiastically, not so much in the secular world. So the idea being that your hope is born in the middle of sorrow, if you like, of cold, of darkness, and that it grows and grows and grows and becomes a man, and the man preaches and teaches and brings us all hope. But then he runs afoul of the authorities, he's executed, but then he is resurrected. And so you have a natural flow from birth to death to rebirth, all in a contained season. And if we extend that into Pentecost, then from the start of Advent to Pentecost is about 6 months. Kind of varies depending on when Pentecost is and when Advent is, for that matter. But it's generally about 6 months. So you have 6 months that are spiritually alive, and then you have another 6 months following that in which your new spirituality can grow. In the ecclesiastical tradition, the period after Pentecost, which is marked by the color green in churches, is called the meadow period, a period when everything has been revealed and now you have to work on it. You have to plow your meadow, if you like. You have to grow until the new Advent when you start again. So you've got 6 months of spiritual discovery, 6 months of spiritual growth. It's actually quite wonderful in a way if you think about it in those terms, and actually mirrors a lot of ways in which cultures throughout the world divide the year. They divide it into a sacred 6 months and a secular 6 months. The peoples of the northwest coast of North America, the indigenous people like the Kwakiutl and the Salish and so forth, also did something like that. You find it fairly commonly. It also means that Christmas and Easter are entangled, and some of the oldest carols that we sing at Christmas actually have an Easter part too. There's one called "Tomorrow Shall Be My Dancing Day." Starts off with Christmas, extends to Easter. Or in more modern times, look at Handel's Messiah. Handel's Messiah has a Christmas portion and an Easter portion because they're all related. And also, historically, Easter was by far the most important festival of the church, and Christmas was there also, but not as important. The development of Christmas as a big festival occurred when the Christmas celebration was adopted as a secular festival. Now, it ought to be obvious that Easter is the most important Christian festival because it's the core of the Christian message. That is, that humans were born in sin according to the Torah, that Adam and Eve sinned, they fell, they were expelled from the garden. And they were given the hope of Jesus when he was born, that they could be saved, and that his crucifixion was his sacrifice to save humanity from its sins, and the reward was the resurrection. So Easter is clearly key. The fact that Jesus was born is not especially relevant to the Christian message. And so for centuries, it was a minor festival within the church. And many churches did not celebrate it at all, except maybe as a single Mass, right? The Christ Mass. But that was it. No decorations, no presents, nothing secular attached to it at all. And the Puritans didn't celebrate it. Seventh-day Adventists, I'm not sure whether they do or not. The Jehovah's Witnesses don't. There are quite a number of denominations and sects that don't celebrate it. In particular, the Shakers didn't. They were a little bit ambivalent about it for a while and decided that it was okay to do something spiritually enlivening on the day. But the whole big shebang of Christmas that we have now is owed primarily to the 19th century, and certainly in England almost exclusively to Charles Dickens and Christmas Carol and a lot of his other Christmas stories. He actually wrote a great number of Christmas short stories that I used to love to read. But Christmas Carol was the one that really put Christmas on the map. So let me just contemplate a little bit about these speculations that Christmas is really no more than Saturnalia or some other midwinter festival. Well, it's sort of true and sort of not true. Now, it shouldn't come as any surprise that a lot of the accoutrements of Christmas are associated with midwinter or the solstice, because those customs are indeed ancient. There are indications that in England, for example, that people brought evergreens inside in the wintertime to enliven the cold, dark nights. All right, that's fine. And there is some evidence that when Catholic missionaries were sent from Rome to evangelize England, that the Pope told them expressly, if they want to bring mistletoe and green boughs inside in winter at Christmas time, just let them. But somehow draw those decorations into the Christian message. And so, mistletoe and Christmas trees and all of that obviously have a history that goes well beyond the Christianizing of Northern Europe. My answer to that is, so what? That it doesn't mean that Christmas is a transformation of pagan traditions. It just means that a few of the non-Christian traditions that were enlivening in some ways were adopted. Same with the egg at Easter, which I'll talk about probably when I get round to talking about Easter. That just because a festival has certain accoutrements that come from outside the Christian tradition does not mean that the Christian tradition itself is an adoption of non-Christian customs. Don't know if I can make it any clearer than that the core message of Christmas is that a Savior is born, and that Savior is the hope of the world. That has nothing to do with Druids, nothing to do with Saturnalia, nothing to do with any of those older traditions. You can say that the choice of December 25th, the old solstice. Now, the solstice is actually these days calculated to be December 21st or thereabouts. But in the ancient calendars it was the 25th. And that could be, I'm not sure, I haven't really researched this, could be because by the 25th, the change of the days getting shorter and shorter and then becoming longer and longer was apparent by the 25th. Not sure about that, but the connection between Christmas and the solstice is very clear. So there is a clear connection between the movement of the earth around the sun, or the movement of the sun if you like, and the festival. There's a clear connection there, but it's a reforming of the idea of what the lengthening and shortening of the days means in Christian terms. It's a Christian festival. And all right, you can adopt all kinds of things around it. Holly, ivy, mistletoe, Christmas trees, whatever you want. But the core values as represented by the church itself are Christian values. So let me try to put things very, very simply. It's clear that the church fathers in the 4th century, perhaps even a little bit earlier, but certainly in the 4th century, chose the winter solstice as the date for the Christmas celebration because it was the turning point of the year, and the symbolism was that Jesus was the turning point of humanity. The fact that Christmas, in its secular manifestations mostly, has accumulated all of these other midwinter things like holly and ivy, the Yule log. Like, why do we have a Yule log? We don't particularly anymore in Anglo-American culture, but certainly in the Scandinavian culture. Well, because it's the middle of winter, right? So a nice big fire is a suitable way to celebrate. And all the other stuff, Rudolph and the reindeer and Santa, and we'll get to all of that later. But the core idea is that Christmas is the turning point of the year and the turning point of humanity. Cultures just gather things around their festivities, just like Easter accumulates a lot of spring stuff. It's not surprising, but it is a false conclusion to reach that because things are associated with the Druids or with the Roman Saturnalia or whatever got attached to Christmas, that therefore Christmas is a repurposing of those old festivities. It isn't. It's a Christian festivity that has adopted a lot of those traditions because of the time of year. All right, I'm going to have much, much more to say about that next time. I'm going to talk about Luke's narrative more, and Matthew's. I'm going to talk about the genealogies and how they were calculated and so forth. Going to do all of that next time. We're in the second week of Advent, so I'm going to do another recipe, I expect. I have no idea what it is yet, but I will do a recipe and then talk more about Luke and Matthew. And meanwhile, please, please, please tell your friends, like and subscribe, and have a joyous weekend.